Hey there, this is the 201 video part 2. We were in the midst of the lesson reading, so we'll continue on with that. The strains of neutrality. Whatever their sympathies at the outset of the war, very few Americans wanted to see American troops fighting across the Atlantic. Their deeply idealistic president, Woodrow Wilson, even hoped the United States might convince the warring powers to negotiate peace. Shortly after war broke out, the president, in an address to Congress, described the United States as one great nation at peace, one people holding itself ready to play a part of impartial mediation and speak the counsels of peace and accommodation, not as partisan, but as friend. He declared that America must be impartial in thought as well as action in order to do what is truly serviceable for the peace of the world. But economic reality and the nature of the war itself made it impossible for the United States to be as impartial as Wilson wished. When the British imposed a naval embargo on Germany, most trade between the United States and the Central Powers was cut off. Americans, however, felt little effect since the United States had always traded much more heavily with Britain than with Germany. Indeed, in the early years of the Great War, the American economy boomed on the strength of trade with the Allies. France and Britain looked to America to supply their armies with food and weapons. The value of U.S. exports soared from $2 billion in 1913 to almost $6 billion in 1916. So with 3 years, and it tripled. While officially neutral, the United States acted as a storehouse and arsenal of the Allied powers. To cut off that vital trade would damage the overall U.S. economy. The end of neutrality. At the beginning of 1915, when the British embargo strangling its economy, Germany ordered submarines called U-boats to sink British commercial ships in the North Atlantic. On May 7th, a German U-boat fired a torpedo into the great British passenger liner Lusitania. The U-boat commander watched the ship sink, later recalling, "It was the most terrible sight I've ever seen. Desperate people ran helplessly up and down, while men and women jumped into the water and tried to swim to empty overturned lifeboats. Roughly 1,200 people died in the attack, among them 128 Americans." American newspapers raged against the Germans, calling them barbarians and baby killers. President Wilson demanded the end of U-boat attacks on commercial shipping. Figuring a complete break with the United States, Germany reluctantly agreed. While the sinking of the Lusitania turned much of the American public against Germany, the isolationist feelings ran deep, and many Americans still opposed getting involved in what they saw as a nasty fight among European powers. In the presidential election of 1916, Wilson campaigned on the slogan, "He kept us out of war," and narrowly won re-election. And there's just a picture of the sinking of the Lusitania. And here's a map too, another map we have of the World War. And this one's a little more detailed because it has lines, but maximum advances the Central Powers shows the trenches, the armistice line, which is the peace line, and so forth. In January 1917, however, it became increasingly difficult for the United States to stay out of the war when Germany announced that it would undertake unrestricted submarine warfare. Under this new policy, the German U-boats would target all ships of any nationality sailing towards Britain. In February and March, the Germans sank several American ships in the North Atlantic. At about the same time, British intelligence experts intercepted and decoded a telegram from Germany's Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to the Mexican government. The Zimmermann telegram, as it became known, then widely published in newspapers, promised that if Mexico joined Germany in a war against the United States, then Mexico would be given possession of much of the American Southwest. In the face of these German actions, President Wilson finally decided the United States could no longer remain neutral. On April 2nd, Wilson appeared before Congress to ask for a declaration of war. Contrasting the democratic governments of Britain and France with the autocratic regime of Germany, an autocratic here, a government controlled by a ruler with absolute power. Wilson declared, "The world must be made safe for democracy." And that's a popular quote if you study history from Wilson. The world must be made safe for democracy. Wilson went on to say, "We have no selfish ends to serve. We are but one of the champions of the rights of mankind." The president concluded, "It is a fearful thing to lead this great peaceful people into war, into the most terrible and disastrous of all wars, civilization itself seeming to be on the balance. But the right is more precious than peace." 4 days later, Congress declared war on Germany. And this map here shows the Western Front, the western side of the war. A lot of it was fought in Belgium and France. Showing the main lines, the trenches, the advances, and so forth. Preparing for war. World War I was the first conflict in which the United States relied mainly on conscription, which means required military service rather than volunteers. Shortly after the declaration of war, Congress passed the Selective Service Act, which called for the drafting of military-aged men. During the Civil War, an unpopular draft had led to violent resistance. But in the Great War, energized by patriotism and anti-German feeling, most eligible young men uncomplainingly registered for the draft. Training an army. To house and train the hundreds of thousands of conscripts, the government built dozens of new military bases around the country. The new soldiers exercised, marched, and learned to follow orders bellowed by their sergeants. But while they learned military discipline, they often received little combat training. A shortage of weapons meant that troops sometimes drilled with broomsticks rather than rifles. Up to 40% of American soldiers never fired their weapons before going into combat. Some authorities worried less about inadequate training than the moral dangers of housing so many young men away from their homes and families. The Secretary of War lamented that soldiers tended to patronize cheap picture shows, saloons, and dance halls. In response, military authorities joined forces with temperance advocates and other civilian reformers to encourage the moral purity of America's fighting men. The sale of liquor was banned near trading camps. Trainees were lectured on the dangers of sexually transmitted diseases. Military officials set up educational programs to build a sense of unifying patriotism in an army composed of dozens of different ethnic groups, with almost a fifth of its members born abroad. One group, African Americans, was deliberately left out of this experiment in integration. A black veteran later recalled, the average white person, whether buck, private, or general, didn't want Negro soldiers. Although African Americans were drafted in proportionally higher numbers than whites, they were forced to serve in rigidly segregated units, and usually were regulated doing manual labor. Eventually, the Army raised two all-black infantry divisions whose members fought bravely in France and won many honors from the French government. And here's this saying the French government gave this regiment the Cross of War for their bravery in action. And just this little side note, opposed to war, Jeannette Rankin. In the House of Representatives, the vote for America to enter World War I was 373 to 50. One no vote was cast by Jeannette Rankin of Montana, the first woman elected to Congress. During the House debate, Rankin declared, I want to stand by my country, but I cannot vote for war. A consistent pacifist, one opposed to all war, she later was the sole member of Congress to vote against America's entry into World War II. Almost 3 decades later, in her late 80s, Rankin opposed American involvement in the Vietnam War. All right, continuing on. Oh, here's a picture. British troops leave their trench to make a night attack. Millions on both sides lost their lives in World War I trench warfare. Over there. By the time the first American troops arrived in Europe in June 1917, the war had raged for almost 3 years, exacting a terrible toll on all the combatant nations. Millions of soldiers had been slaughtered in brutal trench warfare on the Western Front in northern France. Despite the awful losses on both sides, the war remained a stalemate. General John Pershing, the commander of the American troops, believed his soldiers, whom he described as far and away superior to the tired Europeans, would turn the tide in the direction of an Allied victory, which was true. The United American troops, fresh, new, they really were replacing the European troops that were tired and decimated by years of war. The French and British welcomed the arrival of the American soldiers who were known as doughboys. The American troops, fresh and enthusiastic, if only half trained, quickly won respect for their toughness in combat. It was the overwhelming size of the American force that gave the Allies the most cause for optimism. By early 1918, American troops were pouring into France at the rate of 300,000 a month. To a French officer, it seemed that life was coming in floods to reanimate the dying body of France. A popular patriotic song by the Broadway composer George M. Conan caught the brashly optimistic mood of the American forces. Over there, over there. And there's going to be a song we're going to listen to. That's why I'm singing it here. It's later in the lesson. So I won't continue to sing it for you. We'll listen to it in a little bit because that might be painful to hear me sing. Changes on the home front. The American war effort involved more than just the soldiers sent overseas. The process of preparing for war also affected the lives of millions on the home front. And this is in this semester, when we're going to go through World War I and World War II, there's always two sides of it. We learn about the side of the war in Europe, but then we also, really importantly, also really importantly. That's not good grammar. It's also very important to note what's also happening at home. What is happening on the home front of the United States? That's just as important to realize the contributions and how life on the home front was impacted by the war. Changes on the American home front. The American war effort involved more than just the soldiers sent overseas. The process of preparing for war also affected the lives of millions on the home front. The war changes the workforce. American farmers and businessmen continued to prosper on the strength of American exports during the war, but the mobilization of well over 4 million men created a labor shortage. In response, women and ethnic minorities, especially in African Americans, were encouraged to take up occupations previously closed to them. Employers turned to women as a source of labor. Hundreds of thousands left traditionally female occupations to drive trucks and streetcars, operate heavy machinery, and assemble armaments in factories. One female trade union leader happily claimed, "At last, after centuries of disabilities and discrimination, women are coming into the labor and festival of life on equal terms with men." Efforts by women in support of the war effort led President Wilson to endorse women's suffrage, which she declared was vital to the winning of the war, which that is one of the reasons the 19th Amendment passed, because of women's contributions during the war effort. Northern businesses sent agents into the Deep South to recruit blacks to work in northern factories. They were assisted in these efforts by some African American leaders who encouraged blacks to go north to gain new opportunity and escape the threat of racist violence in the South. The writer for the Chicago Defender, an African American newspaper, declared, "To die from the bite of frost is far more glorious than at the hands of a mob." During the war years, more than 400,000 blacks moved north, but the presence of the newcomers frequently aroused racial antagonism from local whites, who feared competition for well-paying jobs. July 1917 race riot in East St. Louis, Illinois, in which at least 40 African Americans were killed, was sparked by anger over employment of blacks in factories holding government defense contracts. I want to go back to the previous page and read this excerpt about the doughboys. No one knows exactly where American soldiers got their nickname of doughboys. One theory says the name refers to the way soldiers on the march got covered with a combination of dust and sweat that looked like dough. Another says it came from the fact that American soldiers were paid 10 times more than French troops, so they had more dough. All right, back to where we were. The wartime state. And actually, I think I'm going to end here because I'm almost to the end of the 15 minutes and I don't think I'll finish that next section. So we'll stop this video here and there will be a part 3 to this lesson 2.08.